You're listening to Bold Dominion, a state news explainer podcast for a changing Virginia. I'm Mary Garner McGee. I don't know about y'all, but this summer flew by so fast for me. I can't believe it's already Labor Day weekend. And we thought it would be fitting to mark Labor Day with an episode about working people in Virginia. So we're going to talk about the minimum wage. What is the current minimum wage? How is it related to inflation? Who earns the minimum wage? And why did the governor pause minimum wage increases in Virginia this year? For those answers, I'm going to turn things over to Levi Goren. They're the Director of Research and Education Policy at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. And they recently wrote an article about Virginia's minimum wage policies. To start off with a really basic question, what is the current minimum wage in Virginia?
Virginia's current minimum wage is $12 an hour. It's set at that level by legislation that was passed in 2020. Before that, we had the same minimum wage as the federal government at $7.25 an hour.
So just to put that in annual terms, that $12 an hour is just under $25,000 per year, and that's if you're working full-time. And the federal one, $7.25 an hour, is just over $15,000 per year. So why do we have a minimum wage? How did the idea of minimum wage come about?
The minimum wage came about as part of the package of New Deal programs when the federal government was seeking to try to address the Great Depression in a way that helped lift working families and get people back on their feet. That's sort of the grounding of the minimum wage is in that era of crisis for our country. And I think that what we saw was the minimum wage and the package of other policies that were put into effect then really helped to build the middle class and create the relative prosperity that we saw after World War II. Unfortunately, the minimum wage was then allowed to erode after 1968. And along with other policy changes, I think that's been a big contributor to the stagnation of living standards for working people since then.
You mentioned that, before we had this $12 an hour minimum wage, it was at $7.25, the federal minimum wage. What can you tell us about the law that passed in 2020 to make the Virginia minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage?
The legislation in 2020, for the first time, took Virginia above the federal floor on the minimum wage and set a higher standard in response to really the stagnation of the federal minimum wage and the need for working people in Virginia to be paid more in order to make ends meet. Policymakers also took the opportunity that year to close some of the loopholes that existed in Virginia's minimum wage law. Unfortunately, when the minimum wage laws were introduced about almost a century ago, they included a number of exclusions of occupations that were at the time mostly occupied by Black workers. And this is part of what we saw was really a pattern of white economic elites trying to set up a two-stage wage system for white workers and Black workers in the state and throughout the South. And policymakers in recent years have been trying to chip away at that and bring more workers into the basic labor protections that we have, including the minimum wage. So in recent years, we saw a closure of the loophole for shoeshine boys. We saw them closing the loophole for piecework, which is when you're paid by the number of items that you produce. You can still be paid that way, but they have to pay you at least the minimum wage. And unfortunately, though, there are still some exclusions remaining in Virginia's minimum wage law. Probably most significantly, the exclusion of farm workers. In Virginia, farm workers can still be paid below the Virginia minimum wage. And we know that this primarily impacts Latino workers today. And there was an attempt this year to undo that exclusion. Unfortunately, that legislation was vetoed. So that's going to be continued work. It's really important that we remove the remaining exclusions for farm workers and other workers who are not currently included in Virginia's minimum wage.
I'm curious, why do you think the two loopholes that you mentioned were able to be closed before that farm worker exemption? Like, what are the political dynamics there?
I think that when we think about farm work, there's a relatively organized lobby of employers in the form of agricultural employer councils of various sorts. And we've definitely seen attempts by those industry groups to prevent Virginia from having a higher minimum wage for those workers. On the other hand, there's not an organized lobby of employers of shoeshine boys at this point. So that's not an issue that we face politically.
So in 2020, when they passed that bill that closed the loophole and started raising the minimum wage, we didn't jump from $7.25 up to $12. There have been some steps. What can you tell us about the step ups and, why would the state decide to do it that way instead of just all in one year?
Sure. So the Virginia minimum wage law that passed in 2020 increased the minimum wage over time in order to allow employers to adjust to the new higher minimum wage rather than just directly jumping to $12 an hour. So we first saw an increase in May 1st of 2021. It increased to $9.50 an hour. And then January 1st, 2022, it increased to $11 an hour. And then we got to $12 an hour at the beginning of 2023. Unfortunately, that's currently where we are stuck at the moment. We will see a small inflation increase this coming January 1st based on the inflation that happened during 2023, but that will not keep up with the actual level of inflation that we've had in the last couple of years.
Like you said, this bill was in the General Assembly. It passed the General Assembly. That would kind of keep us on track on that increasing minimum wage every year. And then it got vetoed. What can you tell us about the momentum behind the bill and then why the governor vetoed it or might have vetoed it?
Yeah, the 2020 law included this increase to $12 an hour by January 1st of 2023. And then it also laid out a pathway to $15 an hour by January 1st, 2026. However, it included some language that stated that the law had to be passed again in order to stay on that pathway to $15 an hour. So that was what legislators attempted to do this year, was to keep Virginia on the pathway to $15 an hour by repassing the law. There's also an interesting new report that just came out from the state that looked at the impact of the minimum wage and basically said that they couldn't find much of any negative harms in part because wages are increasing strongly anyway. So I thought that was also an interesting part of the conversation.
Who is affected by this veto and the fact that the minimum wage will not be going up this year?
The Virginia wages, as we know, have been increasing for a lot of working people, and yet we know that that's not true for everybody, and that there's still people who are being paid under the potential new minimum wage amount of $15 an hour. So when we look at the estimates of how many people would see a raise from going to $15 an hour, it's about 611,000 working Virginians, the majority of whom are people of color and the majority of whom are working women. So, and it's also, I think that sometimes when folks think about the minimum wage, they think that the only people who would be impacted are the folks who are currently making exactly the minimum wage, right? So that would be people right now making $12 an hour. But there's actually a larger group of people who benefit from raising the minimum wage. It would be everybody making between $12 and $15 an hour. And then also folks making just above $15 an hour would benefit because employers will seek to maintain wage scales to reward seniority and leadership. So you'll see folks who are maybe first-line supervisors who might currently be making just slightly over $15 an hour would still see an increase under a $15 minimum wage law as their employer seeks to continue to reward their leadership and seniority.
Can you talk a little bit about what sectors in Virginia, what industries still pay workers the minimum wage? Where do those minimum wage workers tend to work?
So we do see a significant number of minimum wage workers in some of the places where you might expect, including in retail occupations and service occupations of various sorts. We do also see some workers in the agricultural sector who are paid under $15 an hour. One group of workers that I think is an important part of the policy conversation is the folks who are doing home health care and personal care work for folks who are elderly or are disabled and want to stay in their homes rather than entering a nursing home. This group of workers are paid through the Medicaid program that the state and federal government funds. But unfortunately, the reimbursement rates are so low that these workers are paid at or only slightly above the Virginia minimum wage. So that's a pretty big group of workers who would see a wage increase from raising the minimum wage. And I think it's one that is a great example of the important work that people who are paid low wages are doing and how they deserve and need to be paid more.
You've been hearing from Levi Goren, Director of Research and Education Policy at the Commonwealth Institute. Bold Dominion is a member of the Virginia Audio Collective, online at virginiaaudio.org. Here's another podcast from the collective that we think you will enjoy.
Crosswinds is about two Black neighborhoods in coastal Virginia. They've complained for decades about the harmful coal dust from export terminals.
It's just amazing because if you look at it, it's mountains and mountains and mountains of coal.
In Crosswinds, we'll listen to personal stories, expert testimony, and insider knowledge.
Why are you killing my children? Is your profit really worth this?
Spring 2024, everywhere. coaldustkills.org.
So I want to get into a couple arguments or things people might have heard around this discussion about raising the minimum wage. One thing that people raised in opposition to raising the minimum wage was that, it would hurt small businesses in Virginia. What does your research say about that?
A lot of the work around the minimum wage shows that results in little to no job loss because employers are able to either pass along the cost or absorb them through lower levels of turnover. When your workers are being paid more, they're more able to take care of the other things in their life and fix their car and pay for that bus pass to get to work on time. And so we do see some savings often for businesses in the form of reduced turnover when there are a higher minimum wage. And I think the other thing to remember is that most businesses in Virginia are paying well above the Virginia minimum wage. We really see a small subset of employers who are paying these very low wages, including in a number of relatively large industries like the poultry industry.
What would you say to people who say, these businesses are already paying above the minimum wage, therefore this regulation is unnecessary?
Yeah, I think that if a business is already paying above the potential new minimum wage, then they would not probably be impacted by this. And there are certainly a lot of businesses out there that are trying to take the high road and pay their workers decent wages so that they are able to attract and retain talent. And that's a great thing. The minimum wage helps to protect people who maybe are connected with an employer who is, not doing the right thing. And it's often people who have the least access and the least information who end up in these minimum wage jobs.
And then the cost of living and the state of the labor economy is really different in different parts of the state. Given those differences between, say, in Alexandria versus, parts of Southside Virginia or parts of Appalachia in Virginia, why have a statewide minimum wage? Why try to set this statewide floor when people would say that the economy is really different?
Yeah, so Virginia is a state with a strong state government system. We don't give local governments the authority to set their own minimum wages. I think it's also worth thinking about the role of the state government as lifting up folks across the Commonwealth. And that includes lifting up working people in Southwest Virginia and all over the state, as well as in, maybe the more prosperous northern and central areas. There's a lot of research that's been done on the impact of the minimum wage in different areas. And most of that work shows that even in areas with relatively lower median wages. Raising the minimum wage has very little negative impact on jobs and ends up lowering poverty rates and raising the standard of living because people are able to work the same or almost as many hours and get paid more for those hours that they're working.
I'm curious, how is the minimum wage related to income tax? You wrote in your article that the average minimum wage earner would earn about $1,300 more per year had this bill not been vetoed. Would most of that show up in people's paychecks, or would a chunk of it go to income taxes?
Income taxes are at the household level, so the exact effect is going to vary depending on whether someone is the sole earner in their household or if they have a spouse or a parent or a child in the household is also earning an income. But most people earning the minimum wage are probably going to be in a relatively low tax bracket, and I would expect most to be in the 10% federal tax bracket. So most of that additional income that they are earning is likely to come directly through to their paychecks. And we know that, when lower income people see more in their paychecks, they turn that around and spend it in their communities on necessities like getting their car fixed, like going grocery shopping and getting their kids back to school clothing. So we can also often see a real boost to local economies when we deliver more money into the pockets of lower income families.
And then how is the minimum wage related to inflation? This has been a really hot topic, and a lot of families are struggling with prices going up, especially for housing and things like that. How would the minimum wage interact with that?
Sure. The federal minimum wage, as we know, has really eroded over time compared to inflation. It's worth much less than the last time it was increased, and also far less than the minimum wage was worth way back in 1968. So at peak. Here in Virginia, when policymakers increased the minimum wage in 2020, they could have reasonably expected the $12 an hour minimum wage to go a lot farther than it's actually currently going, because inflation in the last few years has been a lot higher than expected. So if we look at inflation between March of 2020 and March of this year, prices for goods have gone up 21%. While as we might have, normally expected them to just go up more like 8%. And, there's a lot of causes for that. Certainly the supply chain issues during the pandemic were a major factor. And I think we've also honestly seen corporate profit taking during and after the pandemic and as a factor in growing prices. So that's one part of the picture of the minimum wage and inflation is the minimum wage providing enough to help families make ends meet. The other part of it is certainly for folks who maybe aren't earning the minimum wage and have incomes higher than that is, would raising the minimum wage impact the prices I see at the grocery store? And what we see is that a relatively small share of the prices that we see for everyday goods are attributable to the wages that are being paid to workers in Virginia. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of the goods that we're buying are not actually being produced here in Virginia. They're being produced someplace else, whether elsewhere in this country or elsewhere in the world. So the Virginia minimum wage is not impacting the price of the production of those goods. And then we also see that there's a lot of other inputs to prices than just the wages. So like in the example of people like to talk about a hamburger at McDonald's, and the cost of that hamburger, it's not just the worker at the front counter and the kitchen, it's also the lease and building costs. There's the electricity and other utility costs. There's the corporate franchise costs. There's all the advertising costs. So there's a lot of other pieces that go into the price of a good beyond just labor. So even if raising the minimum wage increased wages by 10% for those workers, it would not result in a 10% increase in the cost of that hamburger, because only a small share of the cost of that hamburger is actually those workers.
So for the coming year, Virginia is going to stay pretty much at the same minimum wage. You mentioned there'll be that smaller inflation increase. So again, for a full-time worker, looking at about $25,000 per year for a single person. What do you think is next for this issue? Do you think this will come up again in the 2025 General Assembly session?
I certainly think there's a lot of folks in the state who know that they need to get paid more and are going to continue asking their elected officials to make a change and deliver a higher minimum wage for their families. I do not know exactly what's going to be put forward this coming legislative session, but I do know that the minimum wage is going to need to continue to be part of the conversation until we are able to increase it to a level that better meets the needs of working families.
So if people have listened to this episode and, they want to learn more or get involved, what sorts of things do you recommend?
So one way to learn more is you're welcome to go to our website and read our slightly longer form reports about the minimum wage and many other topics. So our website is thecommonwealthinstitute.org. I also think that it's always helpful thing to talk to your friends and neighbors about what's going on in your life and what you think would improve your life. That sort of personal conversation about what's going on is something that we really need to do more of in this country if we want to make sure that we are maintaining and feeding a flourishing democracy. There's also a number of organizations that are working to increase Virginia's minimum wage, including New Virginia Majority and CASA. So those are additional places you could look if you want to get more involved.
Is this entirely a state issue, or are there any things people could do at the local level?
The state of Virginia limits local governments in terms of their options for having a local minimum wage. Certainly, local governments can think about how they want to pay their own workers and making sure that the folks who are driving buses for their students and cleaning up the community centers are being paid a decent wage. But there's not the ability of local governments to actually have their own local minimum wage. There is some proposals at the federal level to increase the federal minimum wage, including one that's being championed by Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia, which would, I believe, raise the federal minimum wage to $17 an hour. So, there's a possibility that we might someday see some movement at the federal level also. But meanwhile, I think it's important to keep pushing at the state level.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative.
Of course. Thanks so much.
Levi Goren is the Director of Research and Education Policy at the Commonwealth Institute. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. I also want to thank our assistant producer, Sarah Bastinelli. Don't forget to subscribe to Bold Dominion on your favorite podcast app, and if you have a minute, leave us a review. It really helps people find the show, and we love getting your feedback and ideas. Enjoy your Labor Day weekend, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.